Larry, it's wonderful to have you here at NED's office, but talking to us. And I would like to start with your assessment of the latest developments in Ukraine.
Well, I think they're very dark. An authoritarian leader bent on aggression and trying to revive the position and greatness of his nation through artificial means rather than building up the economy and mobilizing the extraordinary scientific and technical talent of Russia, in positive ways to compete in the world economy. Instead has made the choice to try and build up Russian greatness and consolidate his own vulnerable political position through acts of aggression. And he has invaded and swallowed up a piece of another country, Crimea. He's in the process of doing the same thing, obviously, in eastern Ukraine. Through similar methods, it's now kind of a playbook. We know what it is. He infiltrates his special forces in unmarked uniforms with masks. In an age of transparency, how do you, convey your methods more bluntly than to, put a ski mask on your troops so no one will be able to identify them? And then, picks a few more militant Russian-speaking sympathizers in these towns who are ready to make themselves available as partners in this crime, and concocts a story that they represent the, quote, will of the people, while the arms and a lot of the techniques and the money is coming from Russia and the modern day version of the KGB and the special forces who have been, I must confess, impressively well trained and skillfully deployed to commit these acts. And so you kind of have a rolling incremental form of aggression and absorption of the territory of another country. I think that it is not just what is happening in Ukraine that we need to worry about. I say this in two respects. First of all, we need to worry about what is happening in Russia, which is becoming an increasingly authoritarian state, and a state increasingly intensely utilizing of information monopolies and ruthless and clever forms of propaganda to rule out any kind of opposition as treasonous. And so you have this great outpouring of nationalist sympathy for what's been done in Ukraine inside Russia, a surge in support for Putin. I think it will be temporary as people wake up to the realities of what Putin is doing to Russia's economic prospects in the medium and longer run. And in the second sense, it's not limited to Ukraine, because I think he has his eye on the Baltic states and other parts of the former Soviet Union and what's called the near abroad. I have a term for this. I think it's a kind of postmodern fascism. I've believed for a long time that if we saw the rise of a Hitler-like figure in the 21st century, he would not be screaming, fulminating, irrational, wildly gesticulating like Hitler was. He'd not be just marching troops in, goose-stepping fashion into neighboring countries. He'd be doing it for the television age, or maybe now even the internet age. He would look reasonable, calm, and you would see much more subtle methods of delegitimation and victimization of opposition control of information, conquest of neighboring territories, and so on. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. The degree of authoritarianism in Russia today is nothing like what it was in Nazi Germany. There's still some civic space for independent inquiry. There's still some tolerance of very limited dissent. But the trends are really alarming in terms of the constriction of this, the intimidation of this, and the all-consuming celebration of the heroic personality of Vladimir Putin. These have a fascistic quality to them.
So I was going to ask you, after Crimea, Putin's support in Russia skyrocketed. How do you explain this trend for the country, for the Russian society?
I think that there are several different dimensions to this, and no one is questioning that his popularity has skyrocketed. I think it's been revealed in a number of polls that have credibility. First of all, the Russian people have gone through, in the post-Cold War era, the post-Soviet era, now a generation, 23 years of economic difficulty, political corruption, political instability, state weakness, loss of the superpower status they had as the Soviet Union, a kind of decline in their national standing that's been matched by a kind of decline in their personal well-being in many cases, and a sense of really humiliation. And so Vladimir Putin has made the Russian people, it's been a temporary thing. It's kind of like you're feeling bad, you have an illness, you're flagging in one way or another, and so you go on steroids and suddenly you feel alert and powerful and strong. And I think Putin today for Russia is like a steroid or like methamphetamine or something. And you get a rush of strength and energy and a sense of power. But it's not sustainable because it's not organic. What's underneath this? It's oil and gas and an impressive cultivation and development of a revival of the tools of military force and what's called black operations, covert operations and manipulation of reality and sentiment to make it seem like what's happening in Ukraine is something different than what's really going on. In any case, Russia is successful at the moment. Russia appears strong again. There is a sense that was generated by Putin and his propaganda machine that Russians were under grave existential threat in Ukraine, Russian speakers, people of Russian heritage and nationality, and so they're coming to the defense of their fellow Russian co-ethnics or nationals. And so all of this makes people feel better about their country and themselves. And this leads to the other factor, is increasingly total domination over the information space. And if all you know and hear is what you're hearing from Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine, that Russians were being attacked in Ukraine, that there are fascists in the streets of Kyiv that are trying to control the situation, that a fairly elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, had been toppled by fascist mobilization with American and European support after he'd wanted to protect Ukraine's dignity by forming a partnership with Russia, yet another humiliation for the Russian people. If this is all they're hearing day after day, with no ability to put objective facts before them, no ability to challenge these contrived realities that are manufactured for them, then it's easy to slip into this kind of hyper-nationalist fever of enthusiasm and excitement. If you don't see the pictures of the grotesque corruption of Yanukovych, with the gold-plated faucets and the palaces so massive that, you know, he probably never visited all the rooms in his residence, the privatization of the economy of Ukraine, with estimates of him and his cabal stealing 5% of the gross domestic product of the country every year, amounting to tens of billions of dollars. If people don't see this, then what do they know about the legitimate grievances that mobilize the Ukrainian people into the Maidan and into an effort, a very risky effort, in which 100 Ukrainians died to seize back their sovereignty?
When we talk about information wars, there is information war between Russia and Ukraine now, but there's also information war between the West and Russia. And there is talk on the Hill now that the United States just are completely losing the war, and that the propaganda machine, here there is no propaganda machine, they say. There is not enough money, there is not enough support for that. Would you agree with that?
I don't agree with the way you framed the question, and I want to push back on that. But I think I agree with the spirit of what you're asking about and what many people are arguing. I feel very strongly as a political scientist that what you are doing, you as a journalist, what the Voice of America is doing, is deeply, profoundly, qualitatively different than what Russian television and the Russian media machine have been doing. I don't think you are engaged in propaganda, and I don't think we should be engaged in propaganda. I think that America wins and democracies win when we promote freedom of information, and when we allow our own correspondents in the Voice of America to raise critical questions and invite criticism of the United States. We're not perfect. We've made a lot of mistakes. Just so people know that I'm critical of my own government, I think the scope and extent of our digital surveillance through the NSA interception system was very wrong-headed and has done a lot of damage to our national interests. But leaving that aside, we're trying to promote openness of information, critical inquiry. Vladimir Putin is trying to generate a line, a story, a contrivance. That's propaganda. The control of information, and quite literally the manufacture of information for a political purpose, with the exclusion of alternative points of view. And I'd say it's pretty obvious that the scaling back that we have undertaken of our tools of public diplomacy and of the enabling and facilitation of free reporting, freedom of information in the post-Cold War era, and particularly in recent years, has been unfortunate, and that we're now paying the price for it. Another way of putting this is, I think Putin has just brought an end to the post-Cold War era. I think it ended with the invasion of Crimea. And we are now in a new era, and I think it'll last for a while. And the marker of it was Putin's invasion and conquest of a piece of a neighboring country. But there are other things going on in China and in other countries that mark a new era of assault on freedom and assault on democratic values. And I think that democracies, not just the United States or even the European Union, but others as well, need to invest more in the defense of freedom and critical inquiry and independent reporting and pluralism of information and ideas. And I do believe the Voice of America is a critical instrument for that, but I think there are a lot of others as well. And I think we need to invest more in the enabling and facilitation and resourcing of local, national, independent news and reporting in social media and conventional media in the region, in the post-communist world.
Continuing on the democracy promotion and talking about the events yesterday, just yesterday, we saw escalation. 5 people were killed when Ukrainian forces were trying to get back the city of Slavyansk. And the day before, on the weekend, Joe Biden visited Ukraine. And in social media, at least, parallels were immediately drawn that after these conversations with Joe Biden, Ukrainian government kind of manned up and decided to go ahead with the military campaign. Do you feel that this is the place where America wants to be in terms of geopolitics now, seen as the power that is inciting this military kind of confrontation?
Well, I don't think we are inciting it, and I think we need to push back against that narrative. This is a narrative generated by Putin's propaganda machine, again, to delegitimate what Ukrainians are trying to do to exert the legitimate authority of the state and defend their national integrity. And he and his politologists and propaganda specialists will seize any opportunity to try and delegitimize any action of the Ukrainian government and paint them as a puppet of the United States, or, you know, if they're really desperate, try and, take me out of my academic obscurity and concoct some ridiculous and fantastic narrative about my own role in this. It's just, you can't just say, oh, this doesn't matter, it's not serious, no one will believe this. It's obvious that the Ukrainian government has its own autonomy and is making decisions that any government would make to assert the rule of law and prevent hooligans and agents of a foreign country from simply seizing local authority and thumbing their nose at the central government. It may seem obvious to rational and fair-minded people, but it isn't obvious when you get into the world of Russian propaganda and Vladimir Putin's exploitation of that for his own geopolitical purposes. And so I don't accept that characterization. I don't think it's true. I think we need to worry about how our actions and statements will be used and distorted by Putin. But we need to push back. The tragedy of Ukraine today, and as a political scientist, I have to have a certain grudging respect for Putin and his military and political tacticians who are executing this slow motion conquest of eastern Ukraine. It's clever in an immediate tactical sense because they're doing everything they can to make it look like the legitimate, social and political forces of aggrieved segments of eastern Ukraine are rising up to assert, their grievances and their right to self-determination. And they put the Ukrainian government in a very difficult situation. It either has to allow this subversion and progressive undermining of the authority of the state, and by the way, blatant violation of the rights of the many Ukrainians in Donetsk and other cities in eastern Ukraine, I think probably a majority, but without a free and open political dialogue and democratic process and debate, how can you know who's got a majority and who doesn't? They put Ukraine in this situation where either the central government has to tolerate this subversion and kind of, thuggish criminal seizure of authority, one kind of community and city government at a time, or it fights back against armed capture of some local office, and then people are killed and they're put in the position of, at least by Russian media, being blamed for, authoritarian and violent actions. When in fact, any government, what would Putin do if the United States, stimulated and paid and organized and even helped to infiltrate organizers to mobilize the seizure of some peripheral Russian cities by presumed pro-Western forces in Russia? There's no way he would tolerate this.
So it's precisely yesterday that Putin said that the use of force against your own people can be considered crime against its own people, he said. So he warned there will be consequences. Do you think that he's actually prepared for a full-scale military intervention?
Yeah, I expect it to come. But I don't think Putin has a grand strategic plan that is thought out 20 steps in advance. My guess is he's operating more tactically, but in a situation where he wins in either case. If the Ukrainian government realizes there's a gun at their head and says, well, there's not much we can do with 40,000 troops on our eastern border, Russian troops, and these black methods, these dark methods of covert operations by Russian special forces in unmarked uniforms to stimulate and organize this activity and be the spearhead of a lot of this seizure of authority, well, we better just let it happen. What can we do? Then he's managed to, one by one, in this kind of rolling operation, assert Russian authority over eastern Ukraine. So one scenario is this rolling operation will continue. The Ukrainian central government will be forced to agree to allow such radical autonomy to these portions of Ukraine in the east that have been swallowed up in terms of de facto control on the ground by Russian intelligence and military and economic operatives with local sympathizers in partnership, that this will proceed so far that he'll basically have de facto control of eastern Ukraine, and he won't have to invade. And they won't necessarily have to secede. You'll just have this de facto reality with this, insertion of a Russian presence into the territory of Ukraine in a way that has ominous implications for the sovereignty and security of the entire country. That's one scenario. And then he wins. The other scenario is the Ukrainian government and people fight back and say, we can't allow this criminal subversion of the rule of law and democratic processes and intimidation of people who may feel a different way in this part of Ukraine to continue. And then the Russian propaganda machine to roll over, and cast this dark cloud over the whole of eastern Ukraine by disconnecting the region from all the television stations in the rest of Ukraine so that they can only see the Russian propaganda machine when they turn on television. Come on, we've got to expose what's happening here. It's grotesque. And if they resist that and say we can't allow that, as a democracy we can't allow that, and we're going to assert the legitimate authority that any state would need to assert, then Putin can portray this as repression from Kiev and send in his 40,000 troops. Either way, he wins.
You mentioned Baltic states before, but they're NATO members now. Do you think that Putin is prepared to neglect this fact?
I think that, as I said, my guess is there's no grand plan. It's not like he's got a script that's saying, today I'm in Ukraine, tomorrow it will be, although I do think he's got his eyes on Transnistria, very obviously, and other parts, we'll just annex Ossetia and Abkhazia. Next it'll be, Latvia or something. I don't think it's quite like that. I think he's probing and waiting to see what happens. I think if the West shows weakness, division, lack of resolve, this will expand and continue. And if we push back, I think he'll pause and weigh the costs and benefits. I think Putin is not crazy. I think he's a highly intelligent man. I think he's a rational actor, and he'll judge the balance of power. And now I think that if we do not defend, it's a pretty untenable situation in Ukraine. The United States, I think it's obvious, is not in a position to send tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine to meet the tens of thousands of troops, Russian troops on the eastern border of Ukraine, and prevent them from conquering eastern Ukraine. And for better or for worse, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and so a military defense against Russian aggression of Ukraine would be a very, very difficult proposition. But I think that we need to begin a very concerted project of economic and military assistance to the legitimate democratically elected government of Ukraine, and at least shore up their capacity to defend as much of their territory as they can over time. In the rest of NATO, this time we need to draw a red line. There really is a red line, and say that any aggression against a NATO member really will be, under the NATO Charter, considered an aggression against all members. And I think if he did in any of the Baltic states what he's done in Ukraine, we would have to consider it an act of war.
When it comes to pushing back, and this would be my last question, so far it has been sanctions, and President Obama again announced that he is working on a new round of sanctions, and he mentioned that he will need support from Western allies on this. Do you believe in sanctions? Do you believe they're going to work? And do you believe in support in the broad support in the West, considering that Europe still depends on Russian gas. It's about 30%.
I think that we are, as I said, I think we're now in a changed world, a profoundly changed world. A world so profoundly changed that I think the post-Cold War, I think we will look back 20 years from now and judge that the post-Cold War ended with the Russian invasion of Crimea. And it's not just Putin, who's probably going to be in power in Russia for a very long time, let's keep in mind, but other powerful states, including China, which has interests in disputed territories in the East and South China Sea and so on. Everybody's making judgments here. Iran, North Korea, dangerous rogue states, I think it's fair to say. And so we have to send certain messages to the world about international law and the inviolable nature of legitimately recognized boundaries. So I think it's an existential moment. It's so existential that I think it has become one of the highest national security priorities of the United States going forward to ensure that Europe is going to have a sufficient supply of natural gas and other sources of energy. Maybe the energy mix will change in the medium term so that it no longer has to depend on Russian gas. I think that it's going to take a while, but that we need to be building new export facilities for liquefied natural gas on the East Coast to ship to Europe. I think we may need to divert some of our own supplies to Europe in the near to medium term. Look, Europe is at risk of suffering much greater economic pain and dislocation than the United States. If we're serious about this, and I've just said, I think it's an existential threat to the world order, then we have to make clear to our European allies that we are willing to share with them the economic pain, and that we consider it a matter of overriding geopolitical importance to help them and partner with them to develop a strategy to diminish and ultimately end their dependence on Russian natural gas.